There's been a rarity on NASDAQ as late last week, LB Pharma filed to go public on the market. This comes as green shoots continue to appear on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. We'll discuss the state of the market for fresh paper on the latest BioCentury this week. Plus, the latest twist in Stealth Biotherapeutics' decade-long regulatory roller coaster. Is FDA's about-face on Stealth's Barth syndrome application a positive sign for rare disease therapies? And the university industry engine that drives U.S. innovation is under attack. So says David Beyer and John Osborne in a guest commentary in BioCentury. And we'll hear from our colleague on the BD side, Josh Berlin, as he gets ready to head to Asia for a couple of big events this fall. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and joining me today on the BioCentury This Week podcast are my colleagues
Steve Usden, Washington editor.
Paul Bonanos, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Josh Berlin, Head of Business Development.
Excellent. Well, we received a few comments from listeners last week. One was, hey, you guys, start talking about Japan. There's more biotech in Asia than just China. So I promise that will be coming in an upcoming episode. I have a Japan story that is coming out soon. It will give us some fodder to chat about things biotech in Japan. In the meantime, I do want to give a shout out to Ken Horn, whose On Ventures recently closed its debut Japan-focused fund. We also received a note from a longtime listener who is a licensing and patent attorney who recently headed over to China. And he wanted to share some of his takeaways, but he had a little trouble getting them to us. And so I had to learn how all this works by working with our production engineer, Cole. The reach us by sending a text link in our episode description is a one-way street that you can use on a mobile device for listeners to post comments. We can see your messages. We can't reply, strangely enough. So feel free to send your comments via email to podcasts@biocentury.com, which is our address if you want feedback from us. We'd love to hear from this longtime listener and get his take on what he or she is seeing on the ground in China. I can also be reached via LinkedIn. All right. Well, Paul, you signed off Friday to hit the swampy Little League Diamonds of Gainesville and surprised me by popping back on late last Friday night to file a story on an IPO filing. I guess the rare nature of this little bit of news, not an IPO pricing, mind you, just a filing was enough to get you back to your desk. What can you tell us, Paul?
Yeah, there have not been very many of those lately, and when they land, they tend to land late Friday. So as you know, and as you said, the IPO market has been very quiet for biotechs looking to get out on NASDAQ. We haven't really seen anything substantial, biotherapeutics pure play, rather, in more than 6 months now. There have been a couple of very small offerings, but nothing bigger than, we usually put the floor at 25 million for what we think of as a more substantial offering. And the company testing the market this time is LB Pharmaceuticals, based in New York. It's more or less a single asset company with a neuropsychiatry program. Their molecule is called LB-102. It's an antagonist of serotonin and 2 dopamine receptors, D2 and D3. There's a generic drug available in Europe called amisulpride, and this is a methylated formulation of amisulpride with some dosing and potency advantages and resultant IP protection as well. And as we've said a few times over the past few years, since IPOs started becoming scarce, the best candidates to get out generally have some clinical data, and LB indeed has some. In January, they announced phase 2 data showing a treatment effect in schizophrenia, significance on a scale measuring symptoms, positive and negative symptoms. It's a PANSS scale you may have seen. And LB believes that the study could serve as one of 2 pivotal trials, so it's looking to fund a phase 3 program now, and that's where the IPO comes in. Its cash position isn't especially strong right now. The prospectus says they have $14.2 million in cash and equivalents at June 30th. So maybe a year of cash for a lean operation, but they're looking to move ahead with that second pivotal trial, and this is how they'll fund it. They are privately held. Obviously, they've raised about a little more than $120 million in equity funding thus far. Some of the top shareholders I'll name for you: Deep Track Capital, Vita Ventures, Pontifex, and TCG Crossover. And I should also mention the company's CEO is Heather Turner, who was president and CEO at Carmot Therapeutics. You may remember Roche buying it in a 2023 deal. We don't know how much they're going to raise, but the banks are Leerink, Piper Sandler, and Stifel, which are typically associated with substantial raises. So we'll have to see how demand goes. Remember, a couple of companies that filed for IPOs didn't get out this year and withdrew their offerings. So, we'll see how it goes for them. Stay tuned.
Thanks for that update, Paul. You mentioned a long drought since a few offerings priced early this year. Who were those companies? I recall Metsera maybe being one, and how have they done in the aftermarket?
That is one. And I was actually a little surprised when I looked this morning. There are really 4 pure play therapeutics companies that went public in January and February, and none since. I don't mean to disregard a couple of life sciences companies that got out since then. There's like a cell analysis company, Caris Life Sciences. But among drug developers, yes, we had Metsera, a metabolic company, Maze, doing renal and metabolic, Cyana, a cystic fibrosis company, and Aardvark, which has treatments for hunger disorders. And it turns out Metsera, that one is the big winner. It's almost doubled in value since pricing. Cyana is also up by about 35% since getting out. Maze is down a few ticks, but not a ton. And Aardvark, not so much. It hasn't exactly cratered, but it has lost some value. So aftermarket performance has not been the worst. I did mention some withdrawn offerings as well. Odyssey Therapeutics, the immunology company, and also Orion Biotech with an ophthalmic program. They filed in January and never made it out.
Paul, we've both been watching what's happening in Hong Kong, certainly a bit more activity than on NASDAQ. What have you been seeing?
There have been a few, yes. We've seen some activity overseas. And one company that went public in Hong Kong recently, a metabolic company called Inogen, got out this month, and it's performed very well. It raised about $87 million US. And at Friday's close, it had nearly tripled over its first week of trading. A little more than a week. I think it went out the previous Friday. And then since it priced, there have been 2 more companies called Long Biopharma and Shanghai Bao Pharma that joined the queue last week to list in Hong Kong as well. So that's encouraging, especially with lots of discussion about licensing deals for assets from China. Here are some companies that are looking to build sustainable businesses, going public and gaining value once they gain liquidity.
Josh, you're always on the horn with folks from Japan, China, India, you name it. Among white guys from the East Coast, you're probably the number one WeChatter. What are you hearing?
Maybe I'm an influencer even, huh?
I
think the Hong Kong Stock Exchange has really been an amazing story this year that I'm not sure is fully sort of understood by everyone in our network. But, the China partnering craze really in part started because of the bear market in Hong Kong. It was really the first bear market in biotech history in China, and that forced a lot of companies to become much more creative in terms of finding ways to finance the company, primarily via deal making. And now you see the deal making is really starting to have an impact, I think, on the Hong Kong exchange itself. So you're seeing the IPOs that Paul was just talking about. And I think the other thing you're seeing is, if you just go look at the Hang Seng Biotech Index over this year, since the beginning of the calendar year, I think at the beginning of the calendar year was around 8,000. It's now around 17,000.
Yeah,
so just
year to
just
date,
a tremendous,
up, Yeah, sorry to cut you off there, Josh. Year to date up 108%. And I remember back in March, Josh, you and I were hanging out in those super cool artificial super trees in Singapore and chatting up some bankers, biotech bankers. And at that time, they were still saying, NASDAQ's the only game in town for Asia biotechs. And, it's changed now. When I talk to CFOs, they're looking seriously at Hong Kong. They're weighing the best place to tell their story. So we'll see how this continues to develop. Well, first up, this will be a big theme at our China Healthcare Summit. That will be in Shanghai. It will be October 22nd to 24th. Is that right, Josh?
Correct. Yeah, October 22 to 24 in Shanghai.
Excellent. So this will be a big theme of that. Advanced rates for the meeting end Friday. We're still recruiting presenting companies. We have some great names there, and we'll have some big names on the panels as well. Josh, who do we have? We have the CEOs of Duality, Innovent. Who else do we have?
Yeah, we have just sort of a who's who of CEOs. Like you mentioned, Duality, Innovent. We have 3S Bio's chairman and CEO. Argo Bio, another company that's done some deals. Crystal Shin of Lenovo Medicines just confirmed, they were the biotech that was just bought out by Sino-Biopharma. And Dejan Yang of Ascentage will be there, which is a dual-listed China biotech, also on NASDAQ. So it's going to be a really good opportunity to meet a lot of these CEOs that you've been reading about via all the deal flow in the news.
And it's not just China. We'll have a great Asia Biotech CEO panel. We'll have Piers Ingram of Hummingbird. We'll have the CEOs of Jexval from Japan and Korea's Aurum Therapeutics. The CEO, S.J. Lee, was recently a guest on our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show. And the CEO of Immunil from India. I think it should be quite a fun event. But before that, you're heading to Japan. Is that right, Josh?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting out to Bio Japan this year, which I haven't been to in a very, very long time. Really thankful to our friends at JBA for the invite to come out there, join a panel, and sort of see what Bio Japan is all about. It's become a much, much bigger event than it used to be, is my understanding. And then we're also going to be co-hosting a reception. For those of you who know Tim Kendall and his company Connectia in Japan, Tim and BioCentury are teaming up on a reception October 7th in Yokohama, the night before Bio Japan. So if you're in town and want to join the reception, please send me a note or send Jeff a note, or we'd be happy to have you join us.
Tim is great. He really knows his Japan. Had a good chat with him for my Japan story recently, and he knows his stuff. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and welcome Mr. Usden back from his travels and talk about stealth biotherapeutics and IP and quite a bit more.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 12th China Healthcare Summit in Shanghai. From in-licensing to new co's, cross-border deals from Asia are transforming global biopharma. Meet top decision makers and investors at the 12th China Healthcare Summit to explore emerging opportunities and tackle key challenges in this rapidly evolving landscape. Join us in Shanghai October 22nd to 24th to get a first-hand look at China's dynamic life sciences ecosystem. Register and learn more at biocenturychinasummit.com.
We are back, and Steve, how was the getaway?
I don't know why I came back. Tell the truth.
to talk
I guess
to
I
us.
came back to talk to you.
Yeah. Thank you for sending me a cat picture of the day. The cats really look like they run that country.
Yeah.
All right. No further comment. Steve is whenever he's in Turkey or Greece, he always seems to encounter some amazing cats. But Steve, I think you were writing about stealth biotherapeutics when you left, and you're going to write about them again today. What's going on here? There's a bit of an about face. This is a company that for years now has been trying to get a therapy to the Barth syndrome community. It's a community where there is a dire need for a therapy. Steve, what is going on with this latest seeming about face?
So, yeah, look, it's another extraordinary turn of events for stealth and for Barth patients. As you said, we've been following this closely for years. It's a Byzantine story, but basically they've been getting the runaround from FDA for years. The company's bounced between 4 FDA review divisions over 5 years. During that time, FDA has told Stealth to submit an NDA, then gave it a refuse to file letter. It approved a natural history study design, then later declared that the results are uninterpretable. At different points, the agency said approval would depend on a new placebo-controlled trial, and then said that it would be unethical or impossible to conduct that kind of trial. Last year, it seemed like things were coming to an end. An advisory committee voted 10-6 that Stealth Biotherapeutics had demonstrated safety and efficacy of its drug. lamipretide. At the end of May, the FDA issued a complete response letter, big surprise, but it didn't ask for substantial new information. This was devastating for Barth patients and for Stealth. Stealth laid off 30% of its workforce, and it said it didn't know if it would be able to stay in business long enough to receive a response from a resubmission. The patient community has been extraordinarily active in the media and in lobbying members of Congress. The Wall Street Journal editorial page called on FDA Commissioner Marty Makary to approve the drug. There have been stories on national television programs. Last Thursday, FDA said it would grant a final decision on the resubmitted NDA by September 26. That's months earlier than the deadline. And what's interesting, on Friday, Barth syndrome patients met with the FDA commissioner and came out of it really thrilled and ecstatic. That's really an extraordinary thing. I can't think of another time when an FDA commissioner has met with advocates for a drug that's under review, that's pending review at the agency. So, yeah, it looks like it's on the verge of granting accelerated approval, something FDA ruled out last year based on data that really hasn't changed over the last 4 years. So if that happens, it'll be great news for Barth syndrome patients, but on the whole, I'd say the saga isn't really good news for rare disease patients at all.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Is there going to be a read-through to other companies developing rare disease therapies?
Well, could be, but we really need to see what happens. First of all, the only reason it was possible for Stealth to consider developing a drug for Barth, which has about 150 patients in the US, not all of whom would be candidates for the drug, is because it was eligible for a priority review voucher for a rare pediatric disease. Congress allowed the rare pediatric priority review program to expire last year. If it isn't renewed, there aren't going to be any more drugs for conditions like Barth syndrome. There's no economic case for doing it in the absence of a priority review voucher. Second, if FDA doesn't create a predictable and rational path for approval, not one that's dependent on getting the Wall Street Journal or NBC News or BioCentury to report about you, it's not going to be possible to get companies to invest in this space. And if you think about it, there are thousands of rare diseases. It isn't possible to have this level of advocacy, this level of public attention for all of them. There needs to be priority review vouchers, so there's an economic case for developing therapies for these very, very rare diseases. And there needs to be a predictable, rational FDA review process that can get these drugs approved or not, but at least a decision made on them in a reasonable period of time, requiring the level of evidence that's appropriate for the disease. There has to be scientific rigor, but there also has to be a possibility for making this happen, and companies and patient groups need to know in advance what that path is going to look like.
All right, and you'll be able to find Steve's story on biocenturypodcast.com. And Steve, we had a guest commentary that we published last week. David Beyer, who's managing director of Bay City Capital, and John Osborne, who's a professor of law at the University of Washington. They argued that the university industry engine driving U.S. innovation is under attack. What's your take on this?
So here's the thing that precipitated it. President Trump demanded that Harvard account for its compliance with the Bayh-Dole obligations across its entire portfolio of almost 6,000 patents arising from research that was supported in whole or in part with federal funds. That's an extraordinary demand for a couple of reasons. The idea of the federal government exercising march-in rights on Bayh-Dole has been anathema to Republicans traditionally, and the idea that a university would have to go back retroactively and justify all of the patents that it's ever received, basically, in part from federal funding, is extraordinary. What David Beyer, who, by the way, was years and years ago, was a domestic policy advisor for Al Gore. He had senior positions at Genentech and at Amgen, and as you mentioned, he's at Bay City Capital. What they argue is that this is retaliation for the university's First Amendment protected speech. And basically, they say that by going after Harvard on this, that the Trump administration is creating a threat to the entire American biopharma industry. Here's a quote from the end of their commentary. They say, business leaders especially those in the life sciences and technology sectors, must recognize that misguided attacks on research universities threaten our innovation infrastructure, and they must raise their voices accordingly. They urge countervailing advocacy to support Harvard and other research universities, and they say that a failure to enjoin this counterproductive and illegal exercise of presidential power will lead to predictably disastrous effects, undermining intellectual property rights and limiting economic growth.
All right, and you can find their guest commentary on biocenturypodcast.com. That is in front of the paywall. I'll also drop a link in the show notes. Also on biocentury.com, how China speed is reshaping cross-border business development, a perspective by Josh and myself, looking at how deals are rapidly evolving as China biotechs are gaining more leverage at the negotiating table with Western companies. And Simone had a great conversation on our sister podcast with Annalisa Jenkins. She is an influencer in biotech, to say the least. She is currently chair of Gemma Therapeutics, and she and Simone talked about the future of MHRA and really dug deep into where things are in the UK right now as that biotech hub continues to grow. And our back to school issue is out now. Steve wrote, it wasn't as short as I was led to believe it would be. It's a 7-story series, and Steve will be joining Simone on our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show, first week of September, and they'll be digging deep into the issues. Steve, top line, what's it all about?
Basically, what I did was I said, look, imagine that you were starting from a blank sheet of paper and you wanted to reimagine what medical products regulation in the United States would look like. What would you do? And I followed that through. I talked to a number of thought leaders, current and former FDA officials, former FDA commissioners, CEOs of biotech companies, patient advocates, key opinion leaders. And there were some commonalities, some things that they all agreed on, and some things that there was a little bit of disagreement about. My conclusion is that if you were going to start over again, and I think that at some point it's going to be necessary to do this, one of the things you would do would be to separate out medical product regulation from the regulation of foods, cosmetics, tobacco, and veterinary products. I also call for reorganizing the medical products regulation primarily around therapeutic areas, using the Oncology Center of Excellence as a model for the way that other therapeutic areas could be organized, and abolishing the distinctions between the Center for Biologics and the Center for Drugs. And in the long run, I think also eliminating the Center for Devices. I think that those are kind of outmoded ways of thinking about things and organizing regulation. There's a lot more to it. As you said, we'll get into the details of it with Simone when we do the BioCentury Show conversation about it.
You can find the entire back to school package on biocentury.com. I'll drop a link in the show notes. This is our 33rd back to school. We've been doing it every year since David Flores and Karen Bernstein founded BioCentury more than 3 decades ago. And back to school is a forward-looking package that looks at a broad issue critical to the biopharma industry. All right, well, thank you to Josh, Paul, and Steve for joining me today. And thank you to Cole Travis, our production engineer. And of course, Kendall Square Orchestra, which provides the music for BioCentury this week. Tickets are now on sale for the group's 8th season. They'll be rocking some Mahler, some Brahms, and you can find more by going to their website. Thanks for tuning in. We will catch you next week.